And we should be live. Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and your host, welcoming you here for another special report on the geopolitical stage. We've been doing a lot of these recently. Today, we are going to talk about Cuba with RANE's Latin American geopolitical strategist, Mario Braga. Mario, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
All right. Well, Mario, we've had you on before a couple of times talking about Venezuela. It's funny. We thought that was going to be a big deal. It's kind of not even yesterday's news at this point. It's sort of ancient history. Now we've got obviously the world very involved and embroiled with Iran. I've been talking to your colleague Ryan Bull about that. But we're now hearing lots of rumblings that Cuba may be the next domino to fall here. President Trump went as far as to say that he thinks he might have the, quote, honor of taking Cuba, whatever that means. So what I'd like to do is spend the hour here just helping the audience understand, first just understand the situation in Cuba. What is it like today and how did we get here? And then talk about what may happen next. What would a post sort of Castro regime Cuba look like? What difference would it make for America if Cuba sort of normalized relationships, its relationship with America? And what would that mean for the people of Cuba ahead? So how do you want to roll into this? Do we want to do a little bit of a history lesson first of sort of how we got here?
Yeah, definitely. We can start with that. It's a long history, right? I think when you think about Cuba, we cannot miss the idea that since the 60s, the U.S. has imposed an embargo because of the socialist revolution that Fidel Castro carried out, enacting a socialist regime on the island. And then, of course, there is the broader context that in the following decades, we had the Cold War and the ideological dispute between the United States and the Soviet Union, which meant that Cuba represented this kind of adversarial stakeholder and presence just like 90 miles far from the U.S. coast. And that has resulted in various attempts by different U.S. administrations to financially and economically strangulate the regime, to weaken the kind of Cuban leader Fidel Castro. There are also reports of CIA operations. We had 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think these are all elements that show how far back this kind of bilateral relation goes. And to which extent this has become kind of a thorny issue when you think about U.S. politics. So I don't think we need to go into like a lot of the details, but just this idea that this has been a issue for a long time. And I think we can fast forward to two main things because I think they are interconnected. As I mentioned, during the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union being a key ally of Cuba. And to some extent, given the economic inefficiencies, the struggles that the Cuban government faced, it was a major supporter. It was an enabler and a provider of oil and supplies that allowed the Cuban regime to remain because it was in the interest of Moscow to have this influence in the Western Hemisphere. What happened is with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, Cuba loses its main ally. And that means it starts to face a significant economic crisis, which is known as the special period. So without the oil, you have shortages, you have inflation, you have deterioration in living conditions. And that was a harsh period for Cubans. But for the luck of the socialist regime, in a different country in the hemisphere, you have political change in the late 90s. And I think that's exactly what we discussed the last times I were here on the show. That's Venezuela. That's when Hugo Chavez comes to power in Venezuela, and then he implements a socialist revolution. And basically, Cuba, that had lost its main ally in the Soviet Union, and Russia was no longer able to provide as much support, it starts to increasingly rely on Venezuela. And the ways that that partnership operated was that Venezuela would provide oil to Cuba at like highly subsidized, basically in exchange for various types of kind of services and to some extent benefits. But the Cubans provided doctors to Venezuela. The Cubans provided intelligence service. So since Chavez was trying to kind of form this autocratic state, he needed to ensure the loyalty of the armed forces, and the Cubans had decades of experience in that. So it dates from back then, the fact that you have Cuban officials taking part in purging the Venezuelan military, in being part of kind of the special kind of protection of the president. They're called like the Vispas Negras, the black wasps. And if you think on that, on January the 3rd, when there was the U.S. operation, you had, I think, more than 30 Cuban officials that were killed in that action, because that was how was part of this partnership between the two countries. So from the late 90s and 2000s, Cuba becomes increasingly dependent on Venezuelan oil. And that unfolds for most of the past decades. And I think we can put that in context, the kind of why the energy dependency is a cornerstone of this story. Mm-hmm. Basically, Cuba only produces about 40% of the oil that it consumes. So it needs 60% of it to come from abroad.
Okay. So it actually drills for oil on the island of Cuba. It does provide some oil.
Yeah, they have like offshore, not necessarily inland, but they do. They are able to kind of extract oil, but just for 40%. And Venezuela has always provided the kind of, for the past decades, the remaining amount. You have Russia sending a sum. You have Mexico sending a small amount. But as Venezuela entered an economic crisis over the past years, those supplies start to decline. And then, as a matter of fact, in 2025, Mexico overtakes Venezuela and becomes the main provider of oil to Cuba. So having that as an important thing, because not only it relies on oil for what we need oil for fuel and for energy, but the power grid in Cuba is mostly reliant on thermoelectric power plants, so on oil. So if they don't have access to oil, they also don't have the ability to produce electricity, and then the grid collapses. So that explains the fact that over the past year and a half, there have been 7 widespread blackouts across the island. So there was a deepening of this energy crisis. And then I think now we can move to the most recent part of the history between kind of US-Cuba relations to understand how we got to where we are and the Trump administration's approach. So basically, we have decades of embargo that has not toppled the regime. The Castros are still in power by the mid-2010s. Then with the death of Fidel Castro, his brother, Raul Castro, took over the island as president. And then when Obama comes to power, there are negotiations, and Obama shifts the policy from the US, from the embargo to some sort of a strategic engagement that would aim to restore the diplomatic relations and see if this proximity would be a different way to push for change in Cuba, not through economic strangulation, but with kind of a gradual economic liberalization. And with that, if you think that people start to have access to the goods of capitalism, they would perhaps be more willing to protest against the government, and that would eventually lead to the collapse of the socialist regime. I think it's a very similar logic that happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the idea that now that the Soviet Union would open its economy, it collapsed, and there would be Western companies operating in Russia, that Russia would eventually evolve to become, if like in the best case scenario for these defenders of these kind of policies, Russia be on the path to become a liberal democracy, so to speak. And that's certainly not what happened, right? We can fast forward these almost 35, 40 years, and we have Russia as a very autocratic regime, even though it's much more integrated to the world economy. But that was the view, that this could be an attempt and an alternative to decades long of policies that had not resulted in change in Cuba. So basically, the Obama administration, they facilitate flights, cruises to Cuba with this idea that tourism would be a driver of integration. They ease banking and dollar transactions. They start to support the private sector because on the Cuban side, they also make some concessions, and then you start to see kind of small businesses emerge. There are this idea that with Obama being the first president to go to Cuba in a state visit in 2016, that this would mark a very important shift and a turning point in US-Cuban relations. But then what happens is Trump takes office. And when he takes office for his first term, 2017, he reverses these policies that the Obama administration had enacted. And basically, he tightens the travel restrictions. He suspends remittances that are a strong, an important kind of inflow of revenue to the island, to Cubans. And he kind of reenacts the part of the sanctions, and this idea that it would be a maximum pressure scenario. And it's interesting to see that in parallel, in the Trump's first term, you also have him imposing what was described as a maximum pressure strategy on Venezuela, right? So they're trying to kind of suffocate these both leftist autocracies in the region, but that does not work. And then you have Biden coming to power. Biden does not necessarily reverse most of the policies that the Trump administration enacted. It does not, so it don't go back to what was like under Obama. But when we have the return of Trump to power last year, and I think as the year evolves, and then you start to see greater focus of US policy in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean. We saw all of those strikes on drug trafficking boats, and the focus on Venezuela because of the kind of the Cuban energy dependency on Venezuela. It was clear that if something happened to Venezuela, to the Maduro regime, that would prevent its ability to provide oil to Cuba, that would become a major development for Cuba itself. And just to wrap then this kind of how we got here part, the Venezuela angle is not the only way that the Trump administration has pushed other countries in the region to further weaken Cuba. As I mentioned, Cuba provides doctors not only to Venezuela, but to various countries across the region. Basically, it's a way for them to have their kind of highly skilled citizens to generate revenue for the island, right? So they go to the other countries. They are working in remote areas where sometimes doctors, locals, they are not willing to go. And that's a kind of a broad kind of medical program that has existed for decades. And now the Trump administration since last year was going after government officials in these countries that were responsible for signing off these partnerships, and they were revoking their visas. They were making threats of investigations and leading these countries to reconsider their diplomatic and economic ties with Cuba. Some countries, especially the more ideologically aligned ones with the United States, then they start suspending these partnerships. You have some Central American countries announcing that. More recently, you have, I think, Honduras and Ecuador expelling Cuban diplomats, claiming that they are responsible for intelligence gathering in these countries. So all of that are ways to further strangulate Cuba. So Cuba is in a scenario in which it does not have the oil to generate the electricity. Part of the oil from Venezuela, it would also sell to have access to hard currency. And then with these resources, they would import food, drugs. So that also means that you have shortages of basic items. And now we are at a stage in which the lack of electricity, of energy, means that there are rolling blackouts of up to 20 hours every single day. There's no fuel, so no jet fuel, so no flights anymore for a lot of countries. You have just airlines from neighboring countries that are able to do the return flight without fueling in Cuba. That means that without electricity, there is no water provision because there is no pumps. There is no refrigeration, so you can't have food in the fridge at home. That meant that there was no heat a couple of months ago when it got cold. Now they can't turn on fans or air conditioning or anything like that. So the living conditions have significantly deteriorated. Classes have been suspended because people just can't get to the universities, to the schools. There is no trash collection. So there are like piles and piles and piles of trash that are being burned on the streets. People are taking down like doors or wooden furniture to burn, to cook. So it's a very, very dire situation. And then we had for the past 2 weeks, something that's very rare, that are protests occurring across the island, especially in Havana, but also in other cities, because of the discontent with the kind of living conditions, the humanitarian crisis that's building. And I think with that in mind, we can further discuss what the US wants and the negotiations that are ongoing with Cuba. But that's kind of the long story, perhaps not so short, because I know I spoke a lot, but how we got here.
No, it was fantastic context. Thank you so much. So a couple of questions. First off, prior to Castro taking power, which he did in the Cuban Revolution of 1959, I think it was.
Yes.
The country had been ruled by Batista, correct?
Yes.
And he had ruled kind of off and on over decades, right? And I don't know a ton about him. I mean, I've heard he was, kind of a dictator type of guy as well. But the country, I don't want to oversell him, but relative to what happened under Castro, the country was flourishing back then, right? There was a lot of Western investment coming in. Havana was sort of seen as a jewel of the Western Hemisphere. That's when the country basically got all the cars that it still uses today, right? So I guess I just want to say, almost sort of similar to, I guess what happened both in Venezuela, but what also happened in Tehran, right? You can see photos of Tehran under the Shah, and it looks very westernized and modernized. And then today it's very different, obviously. Cuba, very similar before and after, right? A much more prosperous before. And as you just said, it's after has gotten to a pretty bad state now.
Yeah, there was this idea that Batista was someone who was to some extent close to U.S. governments, someone who would either enable U.S. companies to operate in different sectors of the island. So he really opened the Cuban economy, and that we can think about, for example, tourism, hotels, sugarcane. But I agree with you, because now we are in such a bad shape of the Cuban economy and living conditions that is a very low bar for a different period not to be as bad as it is today. Mm-hmm. But I think we can't also lose the perspective that there was some discontent with him, although things were better off and there was economic growth, and that the proximity to the US meant that Cubans were getting, as you said, like the cars and the jobs and things like that. But there is evidence that there was also corruption, and there was also the fact that he was kind of almost unilaterally, as you're saying, like he's kind of sort of a dictator himself, but that kind of a leader that consolidates power and is able to rule with within his will, without necessarily having strong checks and balances, that the idea that he would grant licenses and permits for, he would handpick those, right? And of course, that meant that he was getting a favor in return, that he was either being bribed or having access to assets either in Cuba or in other countries, and that the economic prosperity was not evenly distributed across the island. That the kind of regular Cuban was not as better off, or that his life was not improving as much as those that were at the top, as those that were friends with who was in power. So this is a driver of discontent that helps and creates the conditions for the socialist revolution to occur. Because people, at least some people, because of course we can't forget that there was like mass migration. A lot of people were leaving the island even before the revolution occurred. But just to put in perspective that, of course, things were better, but that does not mean that it was kind of rosy and that everyone was happy with it. Because if that was the case, it would have been much harder for Castro to take power. Once he's in power, he has the status apparatus, he has the repression, but there was a sentiment, I think, among some Cubans that things would improve under a socialist regime. And of course, it proved out to be wrong, but there are still people that are loyal to those ideals as well.
Okay. So great context. It was not a utopia, but just to my general point, it was more prosperous than what came afterwards, right? Okay, so obviously, U.S. capitalist country, especially during the start of the Cold War, doesn't love the fact that there's a communist country, basic or socialist, but pretty much communist country, 90 miles off its coast. Just didn't look good, right? Then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, that's a super hard line. Okay, you know what? Our arch enemies, the Soviets, are partnered up with this country. Now they're actually planning to put nukes there. Total hard line, total get that. But the Cuban Missile Crisis passed. And, then we've had decades of this kind of, slowly failing country off our shores. I guess the question is why should the U.S. really care about what happens to Cuba? Like, why the crippling sanctions? Why the constant drumbeat of we got to break the Cuban regime versus just benign guys do what they do? They're a tiny country. As long as they're not putting Soviet military installations there, why should we really care?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them, I think we can refer to geopolitics, but when we think about geopolitics, you're talking about geography, right? The geographic proximity is an important driver. You can think that Cuba can be this platform, not only for like nuclear weapons and military projection of adversarial influence, but either China or especially Russia, they could use Cuba for other types of kind of activities that undermine U.S. interest in the region. As I mentioned before, either for intelligence gathering or even using Cuba as a kind of an outpost for their interests across the region. So there is this notion that the geographic proximity of having an ally of your main adversaries is not welcome. There is the notion that if you let things evolve to a situation in which the Cuban state collapses, or you just don't care enough and things just unfold as they should, and you're just trying to topple the regime and let chaos ensue, that could mean, and I don't think that's the baseline scenario now, but just to illustrate my point, that Cuba could become Haiti, for example, which is completely dominated by gangs, which is there is no clear power structure. And it's a situation that for decades now, even with the support of the UN and different countries and different military deployments and peacekeeping missions, the success has been very limited. Imagine the degree of migration that we would see in those conditions. And that would be a problem for any U.S. administration, but I think especially for the Trump administration, given its focus on kind of curbing illegal migration and undocumented migrants, if you think about the extent to which the Cuban diaspora, especially in Florida, but like Latino voters across the country, that's a sensitive topic for them as well. So that plays a role in U.S. domestic politics. And then if you go beyond that and you think the composition of the current administration, having Marco Rubio, right, the son of Cuban kind of migrants, who is a Secretary of State, who has political aspirations, either to run in Florida or to run for the presidency, then this becomes a major geopolitical issue that can be presented as a win. So as you said, when Trump announced a couple of days ago that he would have the honor of taking Cuba, I think it has to do with this notion that it's something that many presidents have tried to solve, to address. And even if they don't like topple the regime to an extent where you have someone appointed by the US to run Cuba, but if you have someone who's more pragmatic, someone who is willing to make economic concessions, someone who paves the way for longer term political change, as we have now in Venezuela, for example, that can be framed and presented to the U.S. audience, to the voters, to the electorate, as a win, and a win after decades of at least kind of a dead end or an impasse. So I think these are some of the reasons why it's still important and why the Trump administration cares about Cuba.
Okay. How many people live in Cuba, roughly?
You have around, I think, like 10 million now.
Around 10 million. Okay. And how many refugees do you think we've had from Cuba over the decades?
Yeah, the numbers are significant. And I think throughout the decades, you have different moments where you have spikes in that. And of course, that there is a correlation of that with moments of crisis within Cuba. So in the 90s, you have a big wave. And more recently, you have, I think, about, I think it was 20 or 30% of Cubans that left over the past decade or so. So it's a situation in which back in the 90s, you had the Clinton administration having to come up with that rule of the wet foot, dry foot to accept migrants. So if they were able to get to the U.S. soil, they would be able to stay and process their status. But if they were still on boats, they would not be accepted. So different ways in which the U.S. governments have had to address. And just I'm getting here data. So from 2021 to 2024, that's when you have the largest exodus from the island, and you have like 1.8 million people leaving. So it's a very significant chunk.
Wait, from 2021? So just in the past like 5 years, we've had 2 million Cuban refugees come in?
Yeah, almost 2 million leaving the island, not necessarily all to the United States. So you have to think that, especially, let's say, Trump's campaign, he taking office, and the toughening of kind of measures to curb illegal migration, we have a redesign of migration flows across the region. So you have a lot of the migrants that are going through Central America and Mexico, going north. You have them starting to either go back to their countries, either they settle in Mexico. You have, because you're talking about people that are exploited in many ways by human trafficking groups, right? So the coyotes or other organizations that even present themselves as, like, to some extent, travel agencies or visa support firms. I saw many reports that this type of activity has increased in Cuba in recent months and years, but now they offer different routes. So instead of trying to get to the US, now that it's harder to get to the US, they offer a way for them to get to Guyana, and from Guyana they come to Brazil, and then from Brazil they're able to access other countries in the region or stay in Brazil. So you have like a new flows of
Right.
migration, but of course the domestic economic situation is the main driver that
Right.
pushes,
But it's an outflow from Cuba.
yes.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier that so the Soviet Union was the key enabler for Cuba during the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, you said Cuba kind of lost a lot of that support. Um, so when it became just Russia, did Russia pretty much just abandon Cuba, or is it continuing to do what it can, but it's a lot less than what the Soviets were doing?
Yeah, I think it's what happens when the kind of the ally, the state that's kind of the sponsor, so to speak, starts to have a lot of domestic problems. They have limited capacity to continue supporting their partners that become less of a priority for them. So that is happening recently, like with Russia involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, it's directing economic resources, funds, money, weapons, its attention, its capacity to negotiate and engage in diplomatic relations is much more focused on Europe, on Ukraine, than it has to step in to help, for example, Syria, right? You had Assad, who was an ally of Russia. And when the situation in Syria deteriorated, the rebels were able to very quickly overtake Damascus and the government, and Assad fled to Russia, but Russia did not send troops or mercenaries or anything that would be much of a concrete kind of support.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about Venezuela, the US was stepping up pressure on Venezuela for several months. And of course, Venezuela relied a lot on both Russian and Chinese military equipment, intelligence provision and kind of agreements and kind of defense cooperation. We didn't see either Russia or China step up their support beyond diplomatic statements that the US should respect the sovereignty of the countries, that attacks or the capture of Maduro were a violation. So that's a very kind of weak deterrent for the United States. So
Right.
if the United States has the understanding that key superpowers that are allied with these countries are not willing to step in, it feels more emboldened to just exert this kind of influence and expand its dominance across the region. So I think that applies to Cuba now, that it's highly unlikely that Russia or China would be able to support, because especially Russia's involved in its own crisis now. And as I said, they sent, I think, like 2 tankers over the past weeks, which would be a defiance of the US embargo. But in the end, the reports show that these tankers have been redirected to Trinidad and Tobago, but they have not reached Cuban shores. So their intent and capacity to support is also constrained.
Got it. Okay. And what might be interesting about Cuba, and we'll get to this in a bit, is there may be a chance here, and you can tell me if it's a credible one or not, that unlike Venezuela or Iran, where the U.S. is forcibly stepping in and removing the leaders against their will, Cuba may actually turn to the U.S. to say, hey, help us out here. But before we get there, I just want to finish making sure I understand the full picture. So Soviet Union collapses, Soviet Union can't support Cuba the way that it did. You have the rise of the Chavez regime in Venezuela, as you mentioned, and then they became Cuba's benefactor energy-wise. Cuba became super dependent on them. I thought I heard you say, though, at some point, Mexico actually started becoming the biggest provider. I'm presuming that's not the case anymore. Has the U.S. administration placed pressure on Mexico to stop sending oil to Cuba?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. So basically, because of the economic crisis in Venezuela and the depletion of its oil and gas infrastructure, production has declined over the past years. In 2025, like from 2022 2021, 2022, Venezuelan supplies start to decline. Mexico has always been a provider of oil on even, they have some contracts between the state oil company Pemex to provide oil, like kind of a transaction to provide, to sell oil to Cuba. And some of that is also under humanitarian aid, so to speak.
Right. They probably don't want a failed country, a failed state next to them if they can avoid it.
Yeah. There is that. And I think there is also, historically, that has been the position of Mexican governments, regardless of the ideology of the presidents. So this is not like a right-left policy. But the fact that you have now President Claudia Sheinbaum, who is a leftist president, and her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was also a leftist, the founder of the Morena party. The ideological affinity, I think, plays a role in a sense that they disagree, and that has been a position of most countries in the region, that there is a disagreement with the US embargo. The notion that resorting to economic policies that kind of undermine people's living conditions to pursue a geopolitical goal, a geopolitical ambition, that's not the right strategy, right? So under this premise, Mexico has historically provided oil, and then when Venezuela's ability to supply crude declines, the shipments from Mexico, they start to pick up. And that means that in 2025, Mexico was the major provider of oil to Cuba. But then when you have, like, I think either December or early January, that's when Trump makes the threat that any country sending oil to Cuba will face US tariffs. And that becomes an issue to Mexico because the Mexican economy is heavy reliant on the US market, right? 80% of all Mexico's exports go to the United States. That accounts in the end for roughly 1/3 of the country's GDP. So it's not like Mexico is willing to face such a risk that could be so detrimental to its own economy to provide oil to Cuba because it thinks that there's a humanitarian crisis, because it thinks that the embargo is not the solution. So we saw from this threat, Mexico also suspending the oil provision. So the last time Cuba got oil from abroad was on January 9. And then from then, we've had in a couple of times, I'd say like 4, 5, 6 times when you had ships leaving Mexico to Cuba, but with humanitarian aid, with food, with drugs, with clothes, this kind of basic items, but not oil.
Okay. All right. So at this point, Cuba cut off from oil from all its sources. It is literally burning through it all right now. The electrical grid is starting to fail. As you said, people are burning, their doors to try to cook their food and stuff like that right now. So very, very hard times there. Okay. So we now get up to the present moment. What do you think is going on there right now? Is it more the Cuban government reaching out to America saying, hey, we really need some help here, and America putting terms on it? Is it America coming to the door and saying, hey, look, we're happy to help, but if you want to get our help, you're going to have to, make a ton of regimes changes? And what do you think America is asking / demanding of Cuba here? Is it the whole regime's got to go and we want democratic elections and something else? Or is it more like Venezuela, where it's like, hey, as long as you guys do what we tell you to do, you'll be okay?
Yeah, so it's interesting because for months we've had the reports that there had been like back channel conversations between the US and Cuba. And primarily these conversations were, there was like very limited information on what was going on. But the main information we had was who was engaging on the Cuban side. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that we had both Alejandro Castro Espina, who is the son of Raul Castro, and then Raul Guillermo Castro, who is the grandson and former kind of head of security, bodyguard of Raul Castro. So there was this idea, because Castro left office. Castro is 94 years old now. He appointed Miguel Diaz-Canel, who is the current president. But Castro is still an important player. Diaz-Canel still consults with Castro on major decisions. Castro is still someone who is able to bridge the gaps between different power groups within the Cuban regime structure. So you have the military that are an important player. There is this Gaesa, who is a company that runs 37% of the country's GDP in terms of the kind of hotels that they run and other kind of economic assets as well. So the conversation seems to have started not as an official diplomatic channel between two governments, but between the US government and parts of the Castro family who are ultimately, let's say, power brokers, or who could be decision makers, or could be seen as stakeholders able to influence the government. So I think that's how things start a couple of months ago. And as they evolve and as the situation in Cuba deteriorates, I think it got to a point where the government itself saw that there was no way out. If there is no oil, there's just so much oil they can burn, and at some point they run out and it would be kind of a collapse. Mm-hmm. So
are they starting to fear for their necks? That like, hey, this could get to a point where the people are going to like literally come after us?
Yeah, I think that's, and I think that's also parts of the US strategy, right? That it creates the conditions for regime change without necessarily the US military being the one responsible for pushing out the government, right? That's even a solution that would give the Trump administration the narrative, or even like the argument that Cubans freed the country from socialist rule. It was not like a coup that was orchestrated by Washington, and that kind of a rhetoric that sometimes we see across the region. But now the understanding is there are conversations between Cuban government officials and US government officials. And for like weeks, we didn't have a lot of visibility on what was being discussed and what was on the table. Back in February, we put out an assessment here at RANE on how we saw the situation being likely to evolve. And for us, the most likely scenario would be Cuba making economic concessions to Washington to secure regime survival. So we have to think that if you are Diaz-Canel, if you are the president of Cuba, if you are a government official, you just saw a president in the region being captured, Maduro, in January. You just saw military action in Iran resulting in the killing of the Ayatollah. So the US has made very clear that it is willing to use military force if needed. Mm-hmm. So that is also the kind of what we could call like an incentive for the Cuban government to sit on the table and say, we do not want that, let's negotiate. So I think that's a driver that makes the negotiations more likely. And then we were talking about this in February before there was a confirmation of official talks. Okay. And then from that perspective, we understood that, okay, what can be on the table to be negotiated? And I think the most obvious things are economic concessions to help liberalize the Cuban economy. So things like increasing permissions for private sector to operate in Cuba, to allow US companies to engage, let's say, in the reconstruction of road infrastructure, of urban infrastructure. You have many buildings in Cuba that are on the brink of collapse. Or if you think about agriculture, they have the sugarcane plantations. They have some mines. There is the possibility to explore tourism. So all these kinds of things could be attractive to US interests and would be concessions that Cuba could make without necessarily those in power losing completely the control of the island, right? That does not mean, and I think we are in a scenario in which we cannot rule out that Diaz-Canel, the president, is forced out of power. Perhaps that is a contentious topic in the meetings, and that is a demand from the US that for the Trump administration to come out and say, well, we won or we got a major win in Cuba. The leadership change is kind of an important step, even if it means we are not talking about regime change, even if it means it's similar to Venezuela in a sense that the structure is still in place, but you have someone new at the top who is much more friendly to the US. And that is not necessarily bad, or it's not something the US would oppose perhaps, or it would be willing to accept, at least for now, because if you take out the entire regime, it's not like Cuba has a strong opposition and someone who can take power. The revolution has meant that for like decades, there is repression of dissent. There are like political prisoners.
It's like a small version of Iran. There's just not a counter leader waiting in the wings. Yeah.
So basically, it's much more a managed transition than a revolution or something in that regard. Because as I mentioned before, let's say the US forces the entire regime out, arrests all the leaders, all the bureaucrats. It starts to, let's say, appoint someone to manage Cuba. You have the risk that there is kind of popular opposition to that, at least in some parts, that could become like an armed resistance, even if it's in a small number, that could cause problems. You have the issue that there are people probably within the rank and file of the armed forces that would oppose that, and to which extent the lack of hierarchy would also become a problem. So a lot of different ways in which a scenario of drastic change could unravel and become unstable, and the kind of unpredictability would not allow for the economic side of things to evolve. So just like with Venezuela, it seems that the US government would prefer a scenario in which there is limited political change or gradual political change over time, but that there is kind of a broader political stability, social stability, and economic predictability to allow for investments. So the private sector could be a driver of economic and social change in the long term. So I think that's where we are headed. And that's where, at least for now, it seems that there are conditions to be overlapped, because the Cubans have started to make concessions. Even before a deal is reached, they have started to liberalize the economy and allow the private sector to expand, because they also need the money. That's the point. It's also in the interest of the Cuban government to have the private sector and help it restore the Cuban economy.
Okay. So to me, this seems like a continuation of what the Trump approach, seems to be, which is, in general, it's not about regime change, although we're about to find out in Iran. It's really more about what people are calling regime influence, right? Which is, we're using our carrots and sticks to basically get the existing regime to do more of what we want to do, right? So big question here, Mario, which is, what do the Cubans want?
You mean the population?
The population of Cuba, yeah. Would they love to see their leadership removed, or do they still feel a sense of national identity with the Castro regime? Would they love to become Puerto Rico, and become like an American protectorate? What would they like to see, besides just being able to eat and not and have electricity?
Yeah, so that's I think the basic issue now, that the situation is so dire, and it has been dire this is not like a months long thing, right? This has been building up for many years and for decades, the deterioration of social and living conditions on the island. You have, and I think it's important to have in mind, a generational gap. So as I mentioned before, people who were on the island on the 50s and 60s, they had some like the hope that the socialist revolution would improve things. They have perhaps some affinity or kind of the idea that Fidel Castro was someone with charisma, who was able to lead the country even if times were tough. So there was this notion, I think, from the older Cubans that the revolution could be a good thing, and that opposing the US was something that, as you mentioned, was part of the national identity. Cubans always say, like, oh, we always find a way, we always adapt, we are tough, and we would, if we need to, we'll bear arms and defend and give our blood for the revolution. So I think that among older Cubans, that is perhaps a stronger sentiment.
Right. But just to be clear, older, those people are like 80 and 90 right now, if they're still alive, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's the thing. But, and this is like a small part of the population. They are not the ones kind of, I don't know, making the decisions even within their families or anything. Mm-hmm. But there is still this sentiment. And I think there are some people, like some of their sons and daughters, that could still relate to that, but to a lesser degree. And then within the second generation, you already have more people who are discontent. But we cannot also forget that the ones that were really, really discontent, they have left the island as well. Mm-hmm. Of course, there is discontent of people who are still there. But many of the people, if you think about what if all the Cubans, they haven't left the island and they were still there, the share of people who would be discontent would be much, much higher, or the degree of discontent would be much, much higher. Many of people have left. And then when we think about the younger generation, they don't have any direct connection with what was a revolution, with what was Cuba in years where there was no crisis. There are people in Cuba that have lived their entire lives in an economic crisis, right? So, and I think that this is where there is this room for the social discontent to evolve to the protest, as we have seen over the past couple of weeks. And we need to underscore that protests in Cuba are really, really rare because of the repression apparatus of the state. Right. So the fact that people are willing, you had people, they kind of banging pots on the streets at night, setting fire to kind of rubbish or other objects. You had one incident in which they tried to kind of invade and set fire to one of the offices of the Cuba Communist Party, not in Havana, but in another small town. You had university students doing kind of a walkout. They were just sitting at the steps of the university, but in a sign of protest because there was no classes. These people are putting their lives in danger, right? They are really risky. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to go protest in a country where protests are allowed. They are in a sharp defiance of the regime. So if it got to that point, it's because the situation has become really, really unbearable for many, many people. And I think that that's something the US counts on to further either weaken the government and pressure the government to negotiate and concede, or even to get to a stage where there's an uprising and they force out the leaders from power.
Right. But what do you think? Do we have a sense? Maybe we don't, but do we have a sense of what those people really would want in the big picture? Do they just want the current regime to treat them better? Do they want a new Cuban leadership in there? Or would they love to have, America and its allies come in and revitalize their country and, potentially become, again, they might not think this at all, but would they be like, wow, we would love to become a US territory and have all the benefits that come along with that? Screw what we've done here over the past 60 years. Mm-hmm.
I think it's hard to have like a very like granular understanding and a good picture because you don't have like reliable data. You don't have surveys, polls. Yeah. It's a country where the elections are not really elections. So you don't get a sense, even if it's like a proxy for opposition or for wish for change. So I think it's hard.
Let me just interject for this because you can wrap this in your question. does the general populace there, as best we understand, do they think of America as like the great Satan, the way that, you know, the Iran population has been told? Or do they think of America as like, that'd be a pretty cool country to be friendly with, but our leaders aren't letting us?
Yeah, I think you can have both, because as I said, you have some people that would still be loyal to what they consider to be a socialist revolution that opposed US hegemony and US pressure to capitalize, that would violate the country's sovereignty. I think that there is this room for this rhetoric. I don't think, like, I think actually that this is a small part, but you cannot kind of dismiss this as not being part of the national identity in some cases. But I think for the vast majority of the population, given the economic collapse and the long-lasting suffering that they have been through, that they would very much welcome any sort of like international support and cooperation. And I think that's perhaps a key angle to have in mind. To which extent the unfolding of this crisis would become something that is framed as a cooperation, as a bilateral engagement, or in which sense this would be the US imposing things on the island. Because, for example, especially if you think about the diaspora, the Cuban expats in the US, they strongly oppose the Castros, right? The Castro regime.
Yeah.
So if you have a solution like we had in Venezuela, in which there is leadership change, but the Castros are still calling the shots, there will be people that will not be entirely happy with that solution either, right? So it's tricky to find a way that would, I think, make like everyone happy. There's no kind of solution for that, but I guess it will depend on how this change is presented and how it's perhaps enforced. I think that there is Cubans have like a national pride, and hurting that, like something that would be, for example, a humiliation of Cuba or Cubans, would of course not be welcome. So it's a nuanced kind of situation to how the U.S. handles the whole regime management from afar.
Okay, and so there are, well, millions of Cubans have left over the years. There's a bunch in the U.S., and you know we've got little Havana there in Florida. Who are rooting for this change. Let's assume for a moment that things end favorably in their opinion, right? Whether that's the Castro regime being dismantled or whatever. How many of the people who have left are the people who were the most dissatisfied, as you said, and they're also the ones who had the means to leave, mostly, right? How many of them do you expect would want to actually return to Cuba?
I think that would only occur in a meaningful way after many years, because we are not talking about a scenario in which it's just like switching the button and then the leadership's gone and now the country is a good place to live. Like, we're talking about a country where infrastructure is significantly depleted, where the residential homes in Havana itself, in the capital, the living conditions are very poor. Like you have kind of part of buildings collapsing, like people leaving their apartments because a wall fell.
I mean, they're driving cars from the 1940s, so they're probably living in things that are crumbling.
That's the thing, like, and for you to imagine someone who has been through that, or who knows like that their relatives are living through that are living in the US, and of course they may be facing hardship, they may be working a lot or something, but of course their living conditions are much better than that. I don't see a scenario in which they would be willing to immediately give up what they have to go back to this scenario in which the situations will be tougher. And since it will take a long time for like investments to materialize, for infrastructure to be rebuilt, for job generation to create enough revenue so people can live better lives. So all this suggests that a kind of a reverse flow that is meaningful, I think would take a long
A number
time.
of years. Okay. Mario, we're coming up on the hour. I'd like to go a little bit longer if we can, because I've got some more questions. Do you have time?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So let's just dream here. Okay. This goes great. Whatever ends up here revitalizes Cuba, raises living standards for the people living there, normalizes relations between the U.S. and Cuba in a way they haven't been for 60 years, longer than I've been alive. What does that look like? What are the benefits of that? Like, what should we all be rooting for here?
Yeah, we had this discussion trying to think, not necessarily like a best case scenario, dream scenario, but how economic integration could look like. So with that in mind, I think we can think that the low-hanging fruits would be changes to tourism sector, or kind of like the cruises, the hotels, and of course the basic infrastructure and the power provision, and a revitalization of the electricity grid. So Cuba has the conditions to host tourists, which would be the kind of low-hanging fruit. And that becomes an inflow of hard currency, and that slowly allows the government to normalize imports and provision of goods and that kind of thing. So I think that's in the, let's say, short to medium term, what could be in the horizon. Then when we start to think more of like a decades long, perhaps more than a decade, you could have a situation in which a country that has a stability, that you don't have like recurring protests, violence, to topple the government, in which the government, as you said, is allied with the United States, and there is this kind of consistency in economic reform. You could have a scenario, again, 10, 15 years down the line, in which US companies could look at Cuba as a place to set up manufacturing facilities because labor would be cheap. And then you could have, and of course, that would require something that takes time, which is training, increasing productivity, and that kind of thing. So that's why we're talking about longer time horizons here. But it could become this hub for also manufacturing and looking for cheap labor, which could integrate some, assembly lines or like electronics or something in those lines. But again, I think this is when we think about a very best case scenario in which many different drivers go very well to an extent where there is predictability for business to flourish.
Yeah. And do you think, the US's position here sort of sounds like guns and butter, right? And we're hopefully starting with butter, right? Hey, let's start, letting private companies come in and help you rebuild your infrastructure, build a tourism business, stuff like that. But presumably there's a guns aspect to it as well, which is, hey, if we're going to start making this investment in Cuba, you're not going to be nationalizing these companies. You're not going to be, a gadfly for us anymore. And if you are, you might find a whole bunch of warships, ringed around your country.
Yeah, it does seem that, especially given the national security strategy that the Trump administration outlined in December, that there is the clear intent to resort to kind of military power as a way to enforce the U.S. Dominance in the Western Hemisphere. We saw reports that even like Pentagon officials were saying that the strikes on boats were just the start of this kind of military campaign that to fight drug trafficking. We saw the Shield of the Americas initiative that got together like 12 presidents from across the region, also trying to push this idea that they could cooperate with the United States and also resort to a more militarized way to fight drug trafficking, but
Right.
all this to illustrate that the Trump administration has indicated this intent to use military force in the region, not only to fight drug trafficking, but to pursue its geopolitical goals by coercing countries in the region to adhere to Washington's interests. So this scenario that you described, in which there will always be the lingering threat that if you don't abide by what Washington is saying, you're at risk. That's something that kind of military action could occur as well.
Right. We instead of the carrot, we bring the stick. Okay. So I want to ask you about the Shield of the Americas in just a second. So this question, I guess, for both Venezuela and Cuba is, Cuba, you're more suspecting. Venezuela, I don't know, maybe we know, maybe we don't. Is the current regime influence, do you think, mandating that somewhere in there are free and fair elections in the future?
Yeah, I think this is something also for the medium to long term, perhaps more long term. Yeah. Because what we can tell from like the Trump administration's like the statements and their actions is that they are prioritizing stability, because stability is a prerequisite for private sector investment. And that, as you mentioned, the kind of private capital is the driver of economic change that paves the way for political change. But like the business cycle, the investment cycle, we're talking about, I don't know, at least 2 years for the very basic things. Mm-hmm. And when we think about oil and gas, or if you think about mining, these are things that take much, much longer. So for there to be conditions for these investments to materialize, I think we need to go through a period of stability that would last at least 2-3 years until there are conditions for elections to occur. That does not mean, especially in the case of Venezuela, I think, that after, I don't know, maybe later this year or early next year, we'll start to see emerging more concretely the efforts for democratic transition, or meaning that we could start to see either the push from Washington or statements that it's about time for the Venezuela to hold elections, something in those lines. But I think that the risk, because when we talk about elections in any country, we're talking about uncertainty, right? Like you have,
they might elect somebody you don't want.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even in terms of policy, of regulation, you don't know what will be the platform, and you don't know if they will win or not. So a lot of companies and investors, they just postpone investment decisions. So there is inherent uncertainty related to elections. And I think in these scenarios in which we are talking about the possibility that an election could result in the dismantling of decades-long regimes and what that could unfold greater. So that's why I think the Trump administration will opt for a very cautious and gradualistic approach, which does not mean that they will not push or back a democratic transition, but I just don't think it will be the top priority, at least in the short to medium term.
Yeah. And what's interesting about all this too is, this gradualistic approach sort of assumes that America is going to continue to have the same worldview, right? And Trump's only in office for another 2.5 years. So for all this to really continue, you would have to presume that whoever succeeds Trump is going to maintain these same policies, right? So some of this might also just be gamesmanship of like, well, we'll do it for 2.5 years and then we'll see what happens after that. Yeah. Let me ask you about the Shield of the Americas. So, so that essentially, to your point, is America rallying its neighbors in Latin America and saying, look, this cartel problem has lasted for too long and gotten too big. We're going to really kind of jointly militaristically go after the cartels. what odds does RANE give this initiative right now of actually succeeding?
Yeah, it's tough to say how well it will go. We're about to publish actually a piece, an assessment exactly analyzing the outlook for this initiative and for the U.S. policy towards Latin America more broadly.
All right, sorry to interrupt, but okay, when you're done with that, let's have you back on and go through that. That's another great topic.
Yeah, it'll be a pleasure, definitely, because the Shield of the Americas, it goes beyond security. It's kind of a coalition, and of course, it has this military angle to fighting cartels, but it also has the goal to limit the influence of adversarial countries in the Western Hemisphere. Then, namely, China, I think, is the main one. Russia, Iran, to a lesser degree. So that what we are likely to see is what we are seeing occurring to Venezuela and to Cuba, but of course in a less overtly way, because we're not talking about countries with dictatorships, we're talking about democratic elected countries, and that the US is not going to just go around and topple leaders across the region. But the fact that the US will likely resort to, as you mentioned before, carrots and sticks, both from like economic side, but from political side, like visa restrictions on government officials, as I said, they have done with those involved in the Cuban medical program, or we have seen U.S. prosecutors launch investigations into some presidents. So this kind of threat, and I think the bottom line for the success of this initiative relies on two different things, or three. We separate the degree to which countries are likely to align to the US, and part of that is based on their economic dependency and the size of their economy and their ability to diversify. So you have Mexico, who doesn't really have like a way out and will likely continue to aim to appease and adhere to Washington, of course, imposing some limits. President Claudia Sheinbaum strongly opposes and will continue to oppose U.S. unilateral operations on Mexican territory. There is room perhaps for some sort of collaboration. We know that the Trump administration has threatened to strike cartels near the border for a long time, but Mexico is in this very special position because it really, really depends on exports to the U.S. Then you have Central American countries, which are small economies that are to some extent integrated to nearshoring to the U.S. So you have manufacturing facilities there that are integrated to the U.S. market. And these countries rely a lot on remittances from their citizens in the U.S. In some cases, remittances account for more than 20-25% of GDP. And therefore, this makes them more vulnerable and more willing to abide to Washington's demands. And then you have most of South America that are larger economies, export-driven, and who have in China their main trade partner. So if you think about Brazil, Chile, to some extent Peru, to some extent Colombia, they would be less either keen or less in need to stick to Washington, to make this binary choice of, okay, I'm going to abandon China and go on board with the United States, because their economies are much more integrated to China in terms of trade and also to some degree investment. And I think in these cases, the ideological affinity will play a role. So you have countries, there has been a swing to the right in South America over the past years. So you have Javier Milei in Argentina, Rodrigo Paz in Bolivia, Cast just won in Chile, just took office in Chile. There will likely be a right-wing president in Colombia by August. You have Daniel Noboa in Ecuador. So these will become ideological allies that would be more keen to side with the US on some matters, but that does not mean that they would abandon China altogether, because China has become their major trade partner and still would be able to retaliate, for example, if they went against Beijing's interests very openly.
Okay, but, and this is the current administration's view, they definitely want to have, they want to diminish China's presence and influence in this hemisphere. And so, long term, they're looking to have the Western Hemisphere, not be entirely self-sufficient, but be incented and aligned to trade as much as it can within itself, and sure, do business with other countries around the world, but not let a major or biggest competitor like China get a permanent beachhead in Western America. So let me just ask you this, Mario. Just dream with me for a moment. Let's assume the Monroe Doctrine 2.0 gets everything that it wants. And I won't ask you so much about Canada and Greenland, but odds are probably pretty good that the Canadians and Americans will find some way to kiss and make up. They've been, the closest of allies forever. Greenland will take care of itself in some way, shape, or form. So looking down to the south, let's assume for a moment that things go the way we hope they go with Venezuela, right? That over time it becomes more democratic and comes back into the fold. Same thing with Cuba. Let's assume that the Shield of America's initiative actually pulls the roots of the cartels out, and they're not the big issue they are. I know some of these are big asks, but just dream with me. Let's assume that the rest of South America continues this turn towards, hey, let's work more with the U.S. versus against it, and the major economies there, really flourish from getting a lot more investment from North America than they have today. What does that world look like? And is that something we should all be rooting for? As somebody who lives in the Western Hemisphere, that sounds kind of great. I don't want to be too naive about it. And I know that there's a lot of uncertainty between now and that potential outcome. But is it something we should all be rooting for?
Yeah, I think in the sense that there could be, let's say, this alignment on various levels that could lead to kind of prosperity and things in those lines, it could be positive. But when we look at the facts and the reality, I think there are a lot of obstacles for that, because the degree to which we have, just to focus on the economic angle, for example, the degree to which we have the presence of Chinese either companies or investments and Chinese either government, state-owned firms, public banks for development finance, and private capital, the volume that they are able to invest has been and will likely continue to be larger than those from the US and US companies. So that's, I think, one of the constraints that we highlight in this piece we're about to publish, that if China wants, and there is no indication that it would compete with the US for influence in Latin America for now, because it's prioritizing other aspects. It has significantly rolled back the kind of the Belt and Road Initiative and the kinds of investments they make abroad. But if they wanted, they would be able to compete because they are able to provide cheaper goods, because how manufacturing works there, and they are able to have more resources to, let's say, provide in terms of loans and development financing and all these kinds of things. So I think although the US may be able to regain some influence, and of course, as I said, in these countries that are more exposed to US country, this strategy will be more successful. I don't think we can expect that as kind of a homogeneous solution for the entire region, which does not necessarily mean that is a bad deal for the US in the end, because if you have a scenario, let's, as you say, just think about this possibility, a scenario in which the countries in the region are forced or end up reducing trade with other regions, not only China, it leads to a scenario in which you have even economic losses. And I know the channels I've been talking about, financial markets and all that kind of thing, that wouldn't necessarily be positive, because a lot of the companies in the region, the major ones, they are exporters, they are commodity sellers, they need to rely on foreign trade and their ability to remain integrated to global markets to prosper. So there is an angle to that you can't just undo globalization, so to speak, without significantly hurting the way that not only countries but also companies operate.
Right. And I guess, and look, I don't know enough about the administration's plan, so I'm really guessing here, but I'm guessing part of this is sort of like you were saying with Cuba. It's North American capital, I'll include Canada and stuff in this, coming down there and, doing a lot of like, hey, yeah, we'll help you build out your mines, your lumber companies, your plantations, et cetera. And, it's a story of you're going to make more over time, not we're asking you to make less by cutting off China and just sucking it up.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing. It's kind of the trade-offs, right? And that's the challenge, because as I said before, the ideological affinity now plays a role, but you have the issue, as you mentioned, who will be the next president in the United States, and also who will be the next presidents across these countries, because in Latin America, what we have seen over the decades is kind of a pendulum swinging to the right, from the left to the left to the right. And now we are at a moment where that's definitely shifting right. But if we talk about, and as I said before, like the time horizons for these investments like go beyond 5 years, 10 years, we may get to a point where, let's say, even if the next US administration is aligned with the current goals of the Trump government, and they continue to pursue that, there can be a situation in which countries that are now willing to cooperate, that there are changes in government that makes them less willing to do so in the next electoral cycle. So 4, 6, 8 years from now. So that's why it's very challenging to think that we would have consensus for a longer period of time.
And it's a great point, which is, let's say everybody goes along with this, right? But then in 4 years, Brazil, has elections again, and they elect somebody who's on the far left side, and they say, you know what, we're out of this. We're not in this Monroe Doctrine thing anymore. Then the question becomes, what does the U.S. do, right? And if the U.S. response is guns at that point instead of butter, what do the other people in Latin America think about that? Are they on board with that? Or are they like, whoa, wait a minute, if I do something that the U.S. doesn't like and they're going to be that extreme with me, well, maybe I don't want to be part of this partnership either. I mean, you're right. There are a whole lot of factors here. All right. Well, with that, we're going to have to end it here. Mario, thank you so much. This has been incredibly enlightening. And door is open here at any time. If there are major developments on the Cuba story, have you come back and update us on here. I guess right before I wrap up, RANE geostrategic company, your job is just to sort of look at what's happening and try to understand what's going to happen next. You don't necessarily put a value judgment on things, but is there any reason not to hope for Cuba to open up more with America and the West? It just seems like some sort of transition there that looks like it's going to happen is a good thing for everybody. The Cubans themselves, America, the world, if Cuba becomes, more of a trading partner with the rest of the world, not such an isolated nation. Should we be hoping for some sort of peaceful reintegration here?
Yeah, given the current we always call that kind of a multi-layered crisis, right? It's like an economic, energy, and humanitarian crisis. That there is a need for change, as you're saying, for Cuban citizens, and when you think about as a business perspective, the kind of opportunities that could generate. So yeah, we are at a tipping point that, depending on how things go, it could deliver positive changes for various kind of stakeholders involved in the situation indeed.
Okay, and this could be a longer thing we talk about next time you're on, but does Cuba have the potential, I'm not saying the likelihood, but the potential to kind of become like a Caribbean Singapore, right? Where it switches from kind of being a backwater to, because of its geographic location, could it be potentially jujitsu itself into one of the most prosperous countries in the nation over time if it were to play its cards really right?
Yeah, we have different examples of how things could go. Like Vietnam is also a good parallel in terms of remaining in a political system in which there is still like strict control, a kind of autocratic rule, but that has made enough reforms so it became a manufacturing hub for Southeast Asia, and that could be some sort of example or role model for the Cuban regime to pursue. So indeed, there is the potential for it to morph into this more well-established player in the region. And I think the big question will be how far it can go and how far the reforms will be enough to let that happen.
Okay. All right. Well, Mario, look, for folks that would like to follow you and your work in between now and the next time you come on this channel, where should they go?
Yeah, I've been posting a lot of the kind of these takes and analysis on LinkedIn. So yeah, if you're interested in Latin America and the geopolitics more broadly, you can follow me on LinkedIn. And then, of course, always reach out to RANE at info@ranenetwork.com. And that's how we can get in touch as well.
All right, fantastic. And folks, just two quick things as we wrap up here. One, please give your thanks to Mario for being so effusive with all his knowledge and his geopolitical expertise here. You've done a great job of taking something that I think most Americans really don't have a lot of background on, and you packed a lot of context and knowledge into this, Mario, so thank you. Just a reminder that if you did not attend Thoughtful Money's Spring Online Conference this past weekend, but wish you had, especially if you saw the kind of short compilation of all the speakers I published yesterday, you can still buy a replay for the full conference, all the presentations, all the live Q&A at thoughtfulmoney.com/conference. So go there if you want to pick up the replay. And then last, just on this topic, if you know people who would benefit from having the context that Mario and I have talked about here about Cuba, please send this video to them. I don't say that very often, but again, this is something that, as we just talked about, could really be a force for the good in the world if things proceed the way we all hope they will. And like I said, it's something that Americans don't know much about, and yet this country is what, Mario, 90 miles off our southern shore?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we really should have a bigger emotional stake in what happens here. And so if you think folks would benefit from learning what we've talked about here, please share this with them. Mario, I can't thank you enough. And again, I look forward to have you back on, whether it's to talk about the Shield of Americas, once you've written that report, whether it's to talk about more developments with Cuba or Venezuela or somewhere else in South America. I just hope that it's something positive as opposed to, another invasion like we've got going on in Iran right now.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure. And thanks again for having me, Adam. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much, Mario. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.
We're moving into a new digital system. I believe that this will now usher in the hyperinflation to burn off the debt that's being created. So we'll have Amazon stable coins and Walmart stable coins and Kmart stable coins and, JC Penney, as well as JP Morgan, as well as Hong Kong stable coins, the yuan stable coins. So it is an extraordinarily fragmented market, but they are thinking that within the next 2.5 years, by 2028, they will go from about 125 billion stable coins to $2 trillion in stable coins.
Stablecoin adoption is accelerating, with issuance doubling to $250 billion from $120 billion. Offering a more tempered outlook, JP Morgan estimates the market may reach $500 billion by 2028. Meanwhile, forecasts suggest the market could grow to $400 billion by year-end and $2 trillion by 2028, citing limited mainstream adoption and regulatory challenges. Yet, only 6% of usage is tied to real-world payments, while most remains in trading and DeFi. The Genius Act is shaping regulatory clarity, boosting institutional interest as major players like JP Morgan, Amazon, and Walmart explore stablecoin models. Analysts see them becoming core payment infrastructure, bridging fiat and digital money in a hybrid financial system. The speaker, Lynette, the chief market analyst at IDM Trading, argues that silver and gold are massively undervalued compared to their true historical ratios and fundamental worth. Based on a traditional 20-to-1 gold to silver ratio, silver could be valued between $1,300 and $2,000 per ounce, while gold's fair value could range from $33,000 to $40,000. Current spot prices are seen as artificially suppressed by paper derivatives, but since both metals are sound money, they cannot be inflated away like fiat currencies. In times of crisis, gold and silver act as a bridge, preserving purchasing power as overvalued fiat-based assets, and real estate collapse, enabling wealth transfer to those holding real money. Looking ahead, Lynette warns of inevitable hyperinflation as currencies lose credibility. In such scenarios, governments historically revalue gold to restore public trust, often after lopping zeros off collapsing currencies. While gold and silver prices would soar during hyperinflation, gold has historically held elevated value longer than other assets before being adjusted, only to climb again under the new system. This pattern, repeated throughout history, is expected to play out again. As we present clips from the video, firstly, please click the bell symbol and subscribe to receive updates on our latest uploads. We always value your thoughts and feedback.
What happened in 1980 at that $50 mark, I consider this a massive double cup because it did come up to breach that level. And so when it goes above that 50, would 3 or even 4 digits in the silver nominal price, the price that we see, would that be outrageous? No, it's worth at a minimum $1,300 an ounce. And that's just based on the 20th to 1 that historically we were. These were both, well, it's a peace dollar. Okay. These are both $1, little $1 gold coin and a silver dollar. So that's a 20-to-1 ratio right there. So according to my calculations, you're looking at the true fundamental value of an ounce of gold at somewhere between $33,000 and $40,000 an ounce. So at $3,400, spot gold is a ridiculous bargain. But that also then means that silver's fundamental value at this moment is somewhere between $1,300 and $2,000. And remember, the more of this that they do, the higher those numbers go, because this is fiat money, government debt-based money. But gold and silver are sound money. Sound money is money that governments and central banks cannot inflate away. They can manipulate what you see through the use of garbage derivatives, but they cannot inflate it away. The point is they are both money. They're just the opposite sides of that money coin. And as this loses more and more and more of its purchasing power value, these go up in nominal terms. But what they really do is they create a bridge, because when one currency goes away, another one comes in. It's just that you need something and I need something. We need something that will hold its purchasing power intact to get us from one system into the next system. And dare I say it, even have the ability to take advantage of the opportunities that will present as these extremely severely overvalued fiat money assets. And real estate is actually not pure fiat money, because it is a tangible as well, but it's severely overvalued. That's going to flip-flop. So if you can hold your purchasing power intact, you're going to be able to have that wealth transfer your way. Well, I personally do not see it. I see it as inevitable, because what gold really does is it regains confidence. I mean, they want us to think that gold is an old relic, except wedding rings are generally in gold. Good as gold. It's in our vernacular. It's in our DNA, and it's used to regain public confidence after that massive failure, which I believe we are like this close to experiencing, and the hyperinflation. But make no mistake, every single country has a gold revaluation account. They're not going to do it at these levels because it does not reflect all the paper money that's been issued. So what I think we will see, and it's just a repetition of history, because this has happened over 4,800 times. I don't think this time is any different. And that's really what the point is. But they have to, you have to kind of back up to move forward. If they did it now at the artificial level that the spot markets are, then it wouldn't have as great an impact if they wait until they finish blowing up the currency in a bout of massive hyperinflation. And what they do then is, of course, they lop off zeros so people think, well, they've got this under control. So you've got a loaf of bread. And I know this sounds outrageous, but it's not outrageous. It is just a repetition of history, where a loaf of bread might go for, as it enters hyperinflation, a loaf of bread might go for $80,000 a loaf, right? But then what happens? They lop off 3 zeros or 4 zeros as they do that overnight revaluation. And so it goes from $80,000 a loaf to $8 a loaf. But so do your savings, and so do anything that you've accumulated in fiat. And frankly, so will the nominal price of gold. First, it'll go up massively, right, in the hyperinflation. But the difference between, say, your stocks and everything else, that drops dramatically immediately upon the revaluation. Whereas gold, it's on average, so I can't guarantee this, but on average will stay up at that level for about 9 months before it too gets revalued, but then it instantly begins to climb again in terms of that new currency. So that is what I anticipate seeing. I don't anticipate seeing it before we do hyperinflation, because there is not yet the need to regain that public confidence. But I watch that like a hawk, because that, my friend, is the only thing that's keeping all of this stuff together.
The $50 silver level from 1980 remains important because it highlights how heavily manipulated these markets are. Just as gold and silver were once taken from the public and openly admitted to be manipulated by governments, today's spot prices don't reflect true price discovery, with LBMA inventories dropping sharply before partially recovering, while silver holdings remain much lower. This underscores silver's dual role as both an industrial and monetary metal, making it more vulnerable to hidden maneuvers. ETFs like SLV also expose this manipulation. Their structure was altered so they no longer need to back shares with actual silver. That leaves ordinary investors holding paper claims, while powerful players like JP Morgan or Saudi Arabia could still take delivery of the physical metal. This setup creates a backdoor way for institutions to control silver supplies, while the risks and losses are pushed onto the public, who falsely believe they own real silver through these trusts. Let's shift our attention towards the interview.
Yes, I definitely do think that triple digit price. Now, one thing that you mentioned about 80s with the Hunt brothers accumulating silver, because they wanted to leave the US and form their own little country in Texas. However, the importance of that should not be just trivialized or ignored, because what we were really dealing with was an overt manipulation by our government of the silver markets. And everybody was warned. And I have to say, Jesse, I have often wondered when these things that happened, and they seem outrageous to me, like taking the gold away from the population, like taking the silver away from the population, like a sitting president admitting that they're going to manipulate the markets. And I used to wonder how they could get away with that why people didn't rise up and say, no, you can't do that. That's crazy. Well, I think we're living through that right now. And I'm seeing it happen. I think there's a lot of blindness that's going on. So I do actually consider the $50 mark nominal, to your point, to a very valid point, because these markets are manipulated. They are admittedly manipulated. And so if anybody really expects there to be any level of good price discovery with spot gold or spot silver, and I always make sure I say spot because that is just a contract. And when you're talking about silver, there's a chart from the LBMA that they came up, and of course we know that there was a huge rush of physical coming into America at the beginning of this year. And you can see the stores in the LBMA dropping in gold, dropping and then rising again and coming back pretty close to the levels that they had before whatever came out of the LBMA. I'm actually more interested in what came out of the BOE, but let's just stay with the LBMA for a minute, because the same kind of issue with the physical metal being shipped over happened with silver as well, but their stores are significantly lower than they were before that physical push into the US. So what does that tell you? It tells you that silver gets used up in industry. And just like the SLV silver ETF that is supposed to be a basket of silver, they couldn't put the basket together. So back in, I don't remember whether it was 21 or 20, but they changed the prospectus. SLV changed its prospectus so that they didn't actually have to pull a basket of silver in, but rather all they had to do, which is what they were designed to do anyway, which is imitate the spot silver market. I think we could see that because silver is the secondary monetary metal, but it is rather, I'm pretty sure that Saudi Arabia would be considered an administrator, which means that they would, you and I can't do it, but they would have the ability to take possession of the underlying silver. So I think that that is a manipulation to make that happen, because that can happen even more invisibly than what we were just talking about. And since silver is used across every single sector of the global economy, in solar, in medicine, et cetera, and gold is as well. Both of them are, but silver more so straddles that world. I think that this could also be a maneuver to ensure that they get their hands on the physical silver. At the end of the day, the holders of SLV won't. I mean, the normal holders of SLV wouldn't, but JP Morgan would and Saudi Arabia would. So I think it's a backdoor way to do it and have control of it. But the real problem is it would have to be done strategically. Like I'd be curious to see how much of a percentage of the holdings that they already have in silver that would actually represent. Because if they did take out the physical at the same time that SLV itself, that trust, is selling off bits of silver on a daily basis to pay the rest of the fees, the repercussions for the public would be huge. Those that think that they actually own silver with an SLV, they just own shares in a trust. But that could have some really significant significant impact on the risk transfer to the public.
The rise of digital currencies, the undervaluation of gold and silver, and the ongoing manipulation of precious metal markets all point to a fragile and shifting financial system. As fiat currencies weaken and hyperinflation risks grow, physical gold and silver remain the most reliable anchors of purchasing power, offering protection and opportunity during systemic transition. The real question is not if, but when this reset will force the world to rediscover the value of sound money. Do you think central banks will allow the public to benefit from gold and silver's true revaluation? How should ordinary investors prepare for a financial reset driven by digital money and precious metals? Please share your thoughts in the space provided for comments below. Please remember to subscribe to stay updated and to give this material a thumbs up if you found it helpful. We appreciate you coming along on the ride.
It means that the government has to start building stockpiles. And so it's another buyer, and it's a big buyer. This is a really big buyer. But again, this will also, like, who else uses silver? Companies like Tesla are going to have to start stockpiling now because they will know that there are higher prices in the future. Well, anybody that uses a lot of silver in production of goods needs to take a position now and protect themselves from triple-digit silver and gain that same leverage over their competitors. This has the greatest gains in absolute purchasing power. And that is what matters, is value, not price. And so we're looking at the price. It's up $1,000 this year. But is anything else up 48% this year? Not real estate, not stocks, not Bitcoin, nothing.
Since the government must now build silver reserves, it becomes a major new buyer in the market. At the same time, companies like Tesla, which rely heavily on silver, will likely start stockpiling as well, anticipating higher prices ahead. Any business that uses significant amounts of silver should secure supplies now to shield themselves from triple-digit prices and gain a strong edge over competitors. Mike Maloney is a renowned precious metals expert, educator, and founder of goldsilver.com. He explains that governments always find ways to tax people, either directly or through inflation. History, like Weimar hyperinflation, shows how war spending and money printing quietly destroy wealth until it's too late. As people save in fear, devaluation builds, only to erupt in sudden inflation when money flows back. Gold-backed systems once restrained this, but fiat currencies lost all discipline. Today, massive money creation and QE enrich the elite while draining ordinary savers. Gold remains undervalued, but the system will eventually face a reset. As we dive into the video, remember to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. We value your thoughts, so drop a comment below and give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the content.
True, but the problem with government is they will just tax us more. Silver could go to $1 million an ounce, and they're just going to take as much as they can from the population in two methods: the regular tax and inflation tax. And as they print for war, I did a lot. When I was writing my first book, my study on the Weimar hyperinflation was a stack of books about a foot high. And I had assistants. I didn't read all of them. I'm dyslexic. They read them and they highlighted stuff for me to look at. But we did a very intense study on the Weimar hyperinflation. During that World War I, when there's war on your soil, you have a lot of anxiety, and every dollar you earn gets saved. So none of it is in circulation, and it allows the government to keep on printing and printing and printing, and you don't see the dilution of the currency supply. You don't see the devaluation of the currency until the war ends and the anxiety is lifted. And the minute some of that currency comes out of hiding, back then you would stick it under your mattress, not put it in the bank. But once it comes out from under the mattress, look out, you're in for a hyperinflation. And so, yes, it'll make war more expensive. But if we are having war, the population will start doing more saving, velocity will slow down, and the result is that the government can very secretly steal a majority of your wealth without you knowing it until it's too late. And that's what using gold used to do. And then we went from 100% reserve ratio. First we had gold. Then we had gold notes 100% backed. And then we introduced the Federal Reserve and it was 40% backed. And then the Bretton Woods, and it dropped eventually to 8%, but there was no specified reserve ratio. But gold standards opened the door for this scam to all happen again. And so I hope we don't end up, I can tell by what countries are doing around the world that we are headed towards some sort of monetary system that has gold connected to it. Is it going to be another gold standard, or will the citizens of planet Earth wake up and say, no, we're going to use something real and that stores value? And fiat currencies have proven that they don't store value, and mathematically they can't.
Mike Maloney highlights that when manipulation breaks, the free market always wins, whether under fiat, digital currencies, or any system. True wealth isn't measured in unstable prices but in value relative to real goods like gold, oil, or wheat. Fiat money and floating exchange rates distort prosperity, stealing lifetimes of potential growth. History, like Weimar Germany, shows how loss of confidence leads to hyperinflation, where people rush to trade currency for anything tangible. In such times, gold rises faster than everything else, gaining real purchasing power. Today, with gold up nearly 50% this year, outpacing real estate, stocks, and even Bitcoin, it's clear that value, not price, is what matters. Now, let's get back to the interview.
Yeah, and that explosive phase change is when the free market overwhelms the manipulation, and it always has and it always will. It doesn't matter if we're in some digital currency system. It doesn't matter if they lock us in a jail cell and put us to work and extract wealth from us that way. It doesn't matter even if it's the matrix. The free market will overwhelm it. You and I spent a lot of time creating a chapter for the great gold and silver rush of the 21st century. And it's something that I dubbed Wealth Cycles back in 2010, I think. And we measured like everything that we could measure where we could get data that goes back into the 1800s. And what we discovered there, what's going to happen? Yes, the old measurements, if you're using currency. Ratios? No. It's impossible for the ratios not to stop working. Once you use ratios, you are getting rid of the currency. That's being taken out of the equation. When you measure your house value of your home in barrels of oil, ounces of gold, bushels of wheat, tons of iron, pounds of copper, shares of the Dow, when you do that, you start seeing what true value is, not price. We have to stop measuring things in price and start measuring the value of things. Steve Forbes, there was a great animation that our animator Aiden did for Steve Forbes when he was in Hidden Secrets of Money. And he talks about, what if the foot changed every day? So 11 inches one day and 14 inches the next or whatever. Or if you're trying to bake a cake and the clock change, a minute is 40 seconds one day and 90 seconds the next day, things become impossible. Well, that is the US dollar. And all these floating exchange rates severely limit our prosperity and has stolen part of our lifetimes. You can absolutely prove that when you create greater prosperity, a population will live longer and be happier. This is just fact. And so, and you cannot go back in time and repair transactions that didn't happen or prosperity that didn't happen. And so these fiat currencies, these floating exchange rates, have shortened your lifetime and my lifetime. They absolutely have. And this is something that is provable. I had you insert a chart after this of the Weimar hyperinflation, simply because this looks like the Weimar hyperinflation. Yeah. Now, if you look at that early part from the end of World War I up until the beginning of 2020, if you make a chart of just that, that is it's a pre-hyperinflation. I remember we were interviewing Jim Rickards, and I was telling him I had discovered this pre-hyperinflation and I was all excited about it. And he goes, I didn't know I was here for a history lesson. So anyway, that first phase was a conditioning that happened to the population. that loss of 90% of their purchasing power, this is a 90% loss in purchasing power, taught them that if they hold on to currency too long, so the second time that they saw this happening, that's when they started buying anything. A case of doorknobs will hold its purchasing power better than the currency. And so that's what caused that change in public perception and the introduction of fear of holding on to the currency for more than a few seconds caused that endgame hyperinflation. But the point is that gold is going up faster. Every chart looked like this. Real estate looked like this. The stock market looked like this. Everything in Weimar Germany looked like this, except gold was going up at a factor that was greater than all the other things. So it was gaining in purchasing power during this. And it was in my first book. Go back to the Japanese yen chart one more time, the tab before this. And Japan has been stuck in basically a deflationary environment or stagflation during that whole period of time. Prices of real estate and stuff are not keeping up with gold. If gold quintupled, it's probably tripled or quadrupled in purchasing power of real estate, businesses, and anything else you want to buy. Cars have not quintupled since 2007. So that's a real good measurement. How much is a car since 2007? Has it doubled? Well, that means you can get 2.5 times more cars with your gold. Than a year. That's since the beginning of the year. So we just started the 9th month.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else going up this fast? And the answer is no. It's at this point for this year, this has the greatest gains in absolute purchasing power, and that is what matters is value, not price. And so we're looking at the price. It's up $1,000 this year. But is anything else up 48% this year? Not real estate, not stocks, not Bitcoin, nothing. And so that means that this is gaining in purchasing power against everything else.
Both governments and businesses are gravitating for hard assets like gold and silver due to pressures from debt, war expenditures, and currency devaluation. History tells us that true worth endures while fiat regimes inevitably fail. Gold is outperforming almost everything, and manipulation flaws are already visible, so the trend toward material wealth is quickening. Do you believe that governments will be able to conceal inflation this time, or will hyperinflation erupt like it did previously? If governments and large corporations began hoarding silver, how high could it actually rise? Feel free to share your feedback in the comments below. If you found this helpful video, hit the thumbs up and subscribe to keep up with our latest updates. We appreciate you being a part of this journey.
Most of it is leaving the COMEX, which is also very unusual. It's not going into the eligible category in the COMEX, it's leaving. So it's called a loadout. We're seeing massive deliveries and a lot leaving. Who's doing this? Same thing is true here in the West, where 40 plus central banks have pulled their gold out of the New York Federal Reserve, which would for 50 years give access to COMEX, and pulled their gold out of the Bank of England, which would give access to the LBMA. So they're taking physical possession, removing counterparty risk. So anyways, we see all this gold being delivered. Say several things that are provocative or certainly interesting, and that is he's a self-proclaimed gold bug. He said things such as, I want to remonetize the asset side of the balance sheet for the U.S. government. Now, he backed off saying it's not gold, but I'm thinking he's going to remonetize gold.
Physical gold deliveries have increased significantly, according to recent COMEX statistics, with warehouse stockpiles dropping from 45.1 million ounces in early April 2025 to 43.6 million ounces by mid-April, a $4.8 billion decrease. 8 days in a row, traders have been repatriating metal, some of them back to London, as a result of the reduction of U.S. import tariffs on gold. This is the first such run in 14 months. Demand is being driven by trade disputes, slowdown fears, and global tensions. Persistent drops in COMEX stocks may indicate a physical scarcity and lead to a price increase. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated on February 3, 2025, that the United States intends to monetize the asset side of its balance sheet in less than a year. Although a revaluation of gold is not currently being considered, expert Andy Scheckman thinks it might eventually entail remonetizing gold. Highlights that global trade tensions, particularly US-China tariff wars, have rattled markets. Gold, a classic safe haven asset, is seeing increased interest as investors hedge against economic instability. The Moody's downgrade of the U.S. credit rating in May 2025 further fueled this trend. China's gold market is heating up, with speculators and central banks boosting demand. Reports suggest Chinese investors are diversifying away from U.S. dollar assets, and physical gold is a prime beneficiary. Earlier this year, fears of U.S. tariffs on gold imports prompted traders to stockpile bullion in COMEX warehouses. Now, with some tariff exemptions like those for Switzerland, gold is flowing back out, tightening U.S. supplies. Moreover, China has moved forward independently, rebranding the project as BRICS Bridge. This new version is already fully connected with 11 Southeast Asian countries and 5 Middle Eastern nations, collectively representing 38% of global GDP. The 17th BRICS Summit held in Brazil's Rio de Janeiro has come to an end. The one big takeaway from the annual summit was that the leaders of the BRICS countries have decided to move forward on implementing a cross-border payments system, the main global interbank payment network. Gold remains central to the plan, signaling a shift toward a settlement system less dependent on the Western financial framework. We're about to explore the video, but first, subscribe and hit the bell icon to keep up with our newest uploads. Your feedback in the comments is always appreciated.
I think gold is becoming central to a new system. Call it the skeletal system of a new monetary order, whether it be in the BRICS or whether it be in the United States. Last year, the Bank of International Settlements pulled out of Project Enbridge at the 12th hour. They had been developing it with the Bank of International Settlements Innovation Hub with China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates. And the Enbridge technology is a cross-border payment system that allows for instant settlement, 7 seconds, a 98% reduction in fees, cross-border between central bank digital currencies from country to country, free from SWIFT intervention. And the fifth participant in the Enbridge technology is Saudi Arabia. And things were progressing to the point where Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil and the head of the New Development Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank, said, we've agreed in principle to a new settlement system called the unit. It is a digital representation of a basket of 60% BRICS plus currencies and 40% gold, deliverable upon request. And things were progressing, and you could see that gold was becoming central to their theme. And we've agreed upon it in principle, she said. We're ready to roll it out over Enbridge, which is operational. And at the 12th hour, in what amounts to espionage, James Bond movie, the BIS, which is a Western institution, pulled out and said, we're pulling the plug on Enbridge. We can't, and mind you, this is largely a Chinese technology, although through the Innovation Hub it was refined, and thoughts of rolling it into the Western system as well. And they say we can't be involved in any platform that will allow countries to sidestep Western sanctions. And so they pulled out. Now it's as if they just realized that Russia was the R in BRICS. And then things went very quiet. Now, since then, we've seen some very, very significant things that I think are largely being ignored by the West. And in particular, the new M-Bridge, let's call it repackaging, it's called BRICS Bridge. And BRICS Bridge has now been rolled out officially by China. And they're calling it the renminbi cross-border payment system, first and foremost. So what I believe is happening is because Trump is putting so much pressure on the BRICS, they're kind of stepping out for a second, maybe waiting him out and letting China take the lead in developing the rails of this new system. And China came out about 3 or 4 weeks ago and said, and I've talked a lot about this, that, hey, we have connected with the new bridge technology, fully connected and integrated, 11 Asian countries, ASEAN, these are the countries from Southeast Asia, and 5 Middle Eastern countries. This represents 38% of global GDP.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed that several initiatives are underway within the BRICS framework to develop alternative, independent payment platforms. Crucially, he stated that countries outside BRICS will also be able to access these systems once established. At the BRICS outreach session, there is an ongoing work to create a cross-border payment and settlement infrastructure. And he emphasized the drive to build a more stable global economic architecture, anchored in multipolarity, where trust in Western-dominated institutions is diminishing. BRICS countries, he noted, are positioning themselves as key drivers of this transformation. The Shanghai Gold Exchange, SGE, officially launched its first offshore, international board-certified gold delivery vault in Hong Kong, and he believes this marks a major milestone in facilitating RMB-denominated gold trading and attracting global investors seeking physical delivery in a stable jurisdiction. While the Hong Kong vault is now operational, no confirmed updates yet on vaults in Saudi Arabia, under construction, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Dubai, or elsewhere along the Belt and Road are publicly available. These remain future objectives in China's broader strategy to build a decentralized, resilient gold settlement infrastructure. The new Hong Kong vault, operated by Bank of China, Hong Kong, enables RMB-denominated gold trading with cash or physical settlement. Analysts see the launch, along with 2 yuan-denominated gold products, as a major step in Beijing and Hong Kong's push to expand global commodities trading and potentially erode Western monetary dominance. Let's revise the interview.
You had Sergei Lavrov, who was in meetings with Dilma Rousseff the year before, when they both came out of the meeting, said, we've agreed in principle to this new settlement system called the unit. He's been closely involved in all of the BRICS meetings since day one. And a lot of the technology or a lot of the ideas, the infrastructure of how they would roll things out were his. So in any case, he comes out and says, we're going to issue this BRICS technology, this cross-border payment system. We're going to issue it to non-BRICS members, not just the BRICS. A lot of the pushback with the BRICS has been they're not big enough. When he said that, after they had already connected the Asian countries, it became very obvious that this is bigger than people are thinking. And I said publicly they're going to roll it out to the Belt Road Initiative, which it appears they now are. So what I'm getting at is that this system, which would compete with the SWIFT, will settle in 7 seconds, not the 3 to 5 days it would take these countries to go back and forth from dollars, from their currency to dollars and the other currency, and back and forth at a 98% reduction in fees. And they're going to open it to the remainder of the world. It's just not compatible with the pound, the euro, or the dollar. Subsequently, BRICS Pay is also being rolled out to the Belt Road Initiative, which is 75% of human population, 50% of global GDP. This is the cross-border business to business, consumer to business, small bank to small bank, the retail side of BRICS' agenda. Again, China is doing the central bank side. They're calling it the renminbi cross-border payment system, but it is the BRICS bridge. It is the M-Bridge technology. But rather than antagonize the president, they're letting China do it first. The key to the third piece of this puzzle, the key to it all, at the same time, we get the expansion of the Shanghai Gold Exchange into multi-jurisdictional vaults around the Belt Road, starting with Hong Kong. The vault is complete. The next one is Saudi Arabia, which is under construction now. The idea between all of this is to allow countries to trade cross-border with one another in their own central bank digital currencies. We already have 16 countries officially signed up outside the BRICS, the Asian countries and the Middle Eastern countries, and to settle imbalances in gold through a series of multi-jurisdictional vaults, whether it be the expansion of the Shanghai Metals Exchange, Hong Kong, which is operational. And by the way, the yuan is immediately convertible into gold, not having to first convert to dollars as you would have in the past. So they're saying, okay, China will trade with Saudi Arabia. They'll send them digital yuan for their oil. Saudi Arabia can then immediately convert that into gold if they wish. Right now in Hong Kong, soon to be in their own country, in these vaults as they expand through the Belt Road, very ambitious endeavor, but ultimately connecting to a whole series of vaulting networks, whether it be in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Dubai, the new BRICS Gold Exchange, Shanghai, and the vaults that we see throughout the world. It enables these countries to trade locally in 7 seconds, boosting their own monetary infrastructure, free from SWIFT intervention, and settle any and all imbalances in gold. It's genius. It truly is. And I really hammered this home over the last month. And then yesterday we get an article, or 2 days ago, from Forbes that pointed out that China is now just the third largest trading partner for the United States. And in May, their numbers were less than 6% of trade, which is the lowest level, Daryl, in over 20 years. And the article went on to say that the Asian countries, these same countries that are now hooked up and actually in operation with the new bridge technology, together have a population twice as large as the United States, over 700 million people. They have the fastest growing consumer markets in the world, the fastest growing middle class in the world. And as a group, get this, these countries are now China's largest trading partner by far, way ahead of the EU and the United States. Let me just say that once again. They're connected, and they're the largest trading partner of China, and they can trade cross-border in 7 seconds with no SWIFT interference, no SWIFT recognition. They won't know what's going on, and any imbalances will be able to be settled immediately in gold. This is a massive deal for the BRICS. All right, so that more or less covers the BRICS side of things, where you have, in essence, an expansion of the Shanghai Metals Exchange, connecting with other metals exchanges already in operation in Dubai and in Moscow, the new one that just was built in St. Petersburg. And the ambitious goal over the next year or two is to create this skeletal system of vaults, multi-jurisdictional, so it's not all held in one location like the Bank of England, who had the power to say to Venezuela, yeah, we're not going to give you your gold, thanks anyway, move along. So you want to be able to keep gold in various jurisdictions to mitigate any risk, and then be able to settle imbalances through trade through this entire network. It's important to remember that the Belt Road Initiative, these countries are not in the BRICS, nor is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the largest regional military and financial group in the world, or the Eurasian Economic Union, all the countries that end in STAN, a Russian endeavor like Kazakhstan. These countries are all very, very, very connected to the BRICS. In fact, the president of Belarus has been screaming forever that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, should meld with BRICS. The Belt Road countries, 150 plus countries, 75% of human population, 50% of global GDP. They're not in the BRICS, but they are very connected with the BRICS.
A changing global financial order is indicated by rising physical gold demand, COMEX outflows, and strategic actions by China and BRICS. Gold is recovering its monetary significance as the United States deals with trade conflicts, credit downgrades, and possible balance sheet monetization. a shift towards settlement methods less dependent on the dollar, and SWIFT is indicated by China's offshore gold infrastructure and BRICS-led payment systems. With gold at the center of a new trust-based economic structure, this multipolar movement has the potential to revolutionize international trade. Will the BRICS gold-based payment systems hasten the demise of the US dollar as the world's dominant currency? What effect would persistent COMEX gold outflows have on world gold prices over the upcoming year? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe for more updates. Thanks for joining us on this journey.